Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. My guest today is Chris Sims from Comics Alliance and X-Men '92, Marvel's new X-Men series. Chris, welcome back to Comic Culture.
Thank you. It's great to be back. I always love coming up here to UNCP.
Well, it's great having you. I wanted to talk about X-Men '92. Now, I know that you did a series of episode guides or episode reviews for Comics Alliance, and how did that help you, I guess, hook up with Marvel for this new series?
Well, the episode guide was a fun project to do. It kind of came out of me and a couple of other writers at Comics Alliance doing big, long-form movie reviews of stuff like the Blade movies, the Superman movies, the Batman movies. And over the course of that episode guide, I went through all 70 episodes. So obviously, every week I was thinking about the 90s X-Men. Every week I was thinking about tying those episodes of the show back into the comics they were based on. And when Marvel decided they were going to do the big Secret Wars crossover, they already knew that they wanted to do a 90s X-Men style story. And I ended up talking to the editor on the project, Jordan D. White, and he had been a fan of the episode guide and also a fan of the work that Chad Bowers, who's my co-writer, that we had done on Downset Fight for Oni Press. And it just kind of fell into place from there. They knew they wanted to do a 90s X-Men series, and they knew that we really liked the 90s X-Men, so that's pretty much how we got the job.
Now, the X-Men in the '90s, that was the book. I mean, that was, I guess, the last time we had super large sales numbers.
6 million.
6 million
number
for
one.
X-Men number one, the triple gatefold cover.
Oh, beautiful.
And it's one of those things that when we look back at that animated series, I guess it was Marvel's first serious attempt at bringing canon into an animated series. They had done, Spider-Man in the past and the Hulk, but it really wasn't something where you could pick that up and say, or watch it rather and say, oh, it's this storyline from the comic series. Whereas the X-Men series was tackling the Sentinels and all those other big things that were I guess making up the canon of the X-Men. So in X-Men '92, how are you approaching this X-verse?
Well, that was a really interesting part of how we approached the job. You mentioned the animated series, and the animated series is really interesting because it adapts a lot of the major stories from X-Men history. It adapts the Dark Phoenix saga, the Phalanx Covenant is in there. But they get it all wrong because the cast of those 70s stories isn't around in the 90s stories. You have Rogue and Gambit and Jubilee instead of Nightcrawler and Colossus and Kitty Pryde. So a lot of those stories that they end up doing very faithful adaptations of feel weird and wrong. So we thought it would be fun if we did that and kind of continued that tradition of what if you took other X-Men stories, other major X-Men stories, and filtered them through that lens of the 90s. So what we ended up doing was we settled on E is for Extinction, the first Grant Morrison, Frank Quitely story. And we brought in Cassandra Nova, who's the major villain of that story, into that kind of 90s world where she would have a completely different setup. We made her a lot more complicated than she was originally because, of course, she's a clone. She has ties to Apocalypse. The Shadow King is involved. Because all of those 90s X-Men comics are so complicated. What we didn't know at the time, which is funny, is that there was another project coming out from Secret Wars that is actually based on E is for Extinction that Chris Burnham and Dennis Culver and Ramon Villalobos did, which is a great book. And it was really fun to see us playing with Cassandra Nova in a very different way than they were at the time. But yeah, the approach to it was to take a world where the X-Men were as popular in the story as they were in our world in 1992. Everyone knows who these X-Men are. It's the joke that Chad came up with is that they're fighting to protect a world that no longer hates and fears them because they're super huge celebrities, because why wouldn't they be? They're the X-Men. They're awesome. There's a guy with knives for fists. So trying to approach it that way, I think let us do something that was true to the spirit of the 90s, but not a rehash. We didn't want to just have the X-Men fighting Omega Red. We didn't want to just have the X-Men fighting the Sentinels, because if you want to read those stories, they're out there. If you're a fan who grew up in the 90s, then you've already read those stories. You've already read Omega Red. You've already read Sabretooth and The Brood and the caverns underneath New Orleans. We wanted to do something different, so we took the one villain they couldn't have fought because she's not from the 90s.
It's interesting because it's sort of like when we get a show like Happy Days or that '70s show that looks back at a different time period, and they sort of take a modern aesthetic and they apply it to these older situations. So there's always that wink to the current in the storylines. And one of the things I thought that just summed up the '90s was the opening scene in the first issue, where they're playing essentially laser tag.
Yeah, they're at a laser tag venue called Laser Hut 2000, which that is, no one laughed harder at that joke than I did, and I wrote it. Chad and I wrote it. But yeah, like the X-Men in the 90s, there's that very famous scene, I think it's in X-Men number 4 of the Jim Lee, Chris Claremont series. And it's Wolverine and Gambit and Jubilee playing basketball. And there was always a big thing in the Claremont years where they would play softball. And so we were like, what's more 90s than basketball and cutoff jeans? And we came up with the idea of them playing laser tag. And we do stuff like that all throughout the series. You know, we had like basically a list of things we wanted to include. Our first question to Jordan after we got the job was, can we put Cable in it? Because obviously he was not on the cover. But bringing him in, bringing in X-Force, having Psylocke talk about the focused totality of her psychic powers, all that stuff was really important to us. And it's funny that you mentioned that first page because I know that some people who read it thought there was way too much dialogue because everybody gets something to say. There's a big, complicated narration, and that's on purpose. Like you get a little less of that as it goes on, and it becomes more of our story. But we really wanted to mimic that feeling of having people announce what they were doing all the time and explain who they were, and Wolverine and Cyclops getting into it right at the start. So the laser tag was a big part of that because it's a very competitive environment, and it's something that we could pass off as training, which was a big joke in the early ones, that Cyclops is in this laser tag arena literally playing a game with his teammates, and he says the phrase, "We're not here to have fun," which is kind of our mission statement for Cyclops.
He is sort of the wet blanket in every X-Men story. And
Yes.
it's funny, when you read a Claremont issue of the X-Men, you are actually reading it. If you are reading a contemporary comic, you're probably having a few sparse lines of dialogue here or there. It's a lot more, I guess, visual than it is, something that you've got to sit down and read. And I think you did capture that pretty well. And I think part of it was, this book was released on a digital platform before it was put in print. And it seems like the presentation in the digital platform was designed to be more of a widescreen instead of the traditional, I guess, portrait style printing of a comic. And I'm just wondering how that was something that you were working with in terms of the dialogue, because it was dialogue heavy on the page, but when I'm reading it online, each character is popping up and we're able to just sort of focus on what that one person's saying, and you get a good sense of pacing and rhythm.
That was one of the most interesting aspects of working on it, because Chad and I have been writing comics together since 2007, so we've done a lot of different stuff. We've done webcomics where we were writing a page at a time. We did a graphic novel where we wrote full script, 144 pages, and then gave it to the artist. With this, we were working with Scott Koblish, and he was phenomenal. His art is great, but one of the other things that he did was, because it was digital and because it was meant for that infinite comic style where, you're reading it online and you just click and it advances. You get, each panel essentially comes up on its own, and you can do cool stuff with transitions and lighting and the way that the word balloons pop up. Chad and I don't know how to do any of that. Koblish is kind of an old hand at it. He's done it before. And one of the interesting things with X-Men 92 was that it was the first time Marvel had done a book that was meant for a more or less simultaneous release. Each of the print versions that we have here on the table collects 2 of the digital versions, and they were coming out very close together. So essentially what we would do is Chad and I would come up with a plot, we'd break it down into scenes. So as opposed to having a 20-page issue, we'd have I think 10 to 15 scenes per issue that we wanted to get in. And then Scott would do all of the breakdowns, all of the pacing, all those cool panel transitions that you see online. Those are all from Scott Koblish. And then we would go back in and do all the dialogue. So that made it really easy for us to add in a lot of dialogue. It made it really easy for us to stage conversations. We would, of course, give suggestions just so he would know what was going on when he was drawing. But a lot of the dialogue and a lot of rewriting happened in that process, which is something we'd never done before. And it was a really great experience. And I'm really glad that we got to work with Scott, because he was absolutely phenomenal. He gets it in a really cool way. If you look at what he's doing in these books, it's not quite parody, and I don't think it's quite parody from any of us, from me, from Chad, from Scott, but it's a tribute. We know what the extremes are of that aesthetic, and that's what we're trying to play with. So doing it digitally was it was a challenge in a way because it was something we weren't used to, but it was a lot of fun as well.
Well, you mentioned tribute, and I think before the show we discussed how this comes across. It's sort of like a tribute band. When you go see, Evermore, it's the Journey tribute band or something like that.
Right, it's exactly like a Journey tribute band. Thank you, Terence. I really appreciate you saying that.
If there's a way to minimize something important and good, that's my job. So when you go from the digital page to the printed page, do you have to change the pacing a little bit because of the, maybe you had too much dialogue and what would be a printed page, and now you've got to sort of pare it down, or is it something where you're looking at it laid out and then you're working on the dialogue at that time?
Yeah, definitely. There was a lot. There were 4 different steps to writing this book. We did the initial plot, we did the initial dialogue, we did lettering corrections, and then again, Scott, they called it de-infinitizing it because it was taking the Infinite Comic digital model and then just kind of stacking it up for print. And I really like how it turned out in print. I think it reads really well. I think it's a lot of fun. But I do prefer reading it digitally because you get a lot of those scene transitions. There's a really cool scene in, I think it's number 3, where Cyclops is climbing down a wall and there's a storm behind him, and you see the lightning crashing, and the lightning illuminates the scene, and then it goes back to shadow. And that's something you lose on the printed page. So we did have to kind of go back through and just make sure the dialogue was all clear for what was happening, work on repacing some stuff. One of the interesting things was that in number 2 here, if you read the print version and the digital version, there's a scene where the dialogue's almost completely different. It still works either way, but that's because we were still editing the dialogue on the Monday before the Wednesday it went up, and the issue had already gone to print. It had already gone to press. So things are a little more clear in the digital version in that respect. But yeah, it was an interesting, it was a book that felt like we were never done with it until it was actually out.
Well, it's great when you're working on something and you have that, I don't know, I always work better with I guess a deadline. And having something coming up so quickly that, it kind of forces you to focus a little bit more.
Yeah, there was a long lead time on the project. I signed the contract, I think, at the first of the year, and it wasn't out till summer. So we had a lot of time to plot it, a lot of time to kind of figure out how we were going to break down the script into these chunks. But then once it started rolling out, and once we started getting pages, it was the pace really picked up. And that's the thing about doing comics online versus doing comics in print. You do a comic in print. We wrote Downset Fight, for instance, 144 pages. We lived with it for 3 months, going over to each other's houses, hammering out those pages, getting character designs. And then it didn't come out for another 2 years, which in one respect was really good because by the time it was out, I got to read it and it was almost like I hadn't written it. There were things in there that I'd forgotten that kind of surprised me, and I got to kind of see it with fresh eyes. But working digitally, like we've done with webcomics, like I've done with a lot of self-published stuff, you put it out and it's instant. And 92 was a really weird combination of those, where it was happening all at once after such a long lead time.
Now, what I find fascinating about the artwork is that it captures that Jim Lee, was it Andy or Adam Kubert that was working on?
It was Andy Kubert.
Okay, and they were working on that.
Could be wrong on that one.
And then you have the whole extra straps and thigh pockets and everything else, that very 90s, Lee Field look. And was that something that you were, because I noticed when they're playing laser tag, they've got these huge harnesses on. Is that's something that you're thinking about as you're writing, or is that something that the art is delivering to you and you're just like, wow, home run?
It was definitely something that we thought about, but it wasn't something that we had to tell Scott to do.
Right.
Scott did a really fantastic issue of Deadpool that's a Rob Liefeld tribute issue, and so he draws it in Liefeld style with the big pouches, the big muscles, smoke going everywhere. Everybody's got a katana that's also a gun. He had done that before, and I think our editor, Jordan D. White, had worked with him on different Deadpool projects, and he's got another one coming out really soon that I believe he's doing a complete 20-page story that's taking place across 20 variant covers, which is the first time Marvel's done that.
Wow.
But he was, like I said, he got it instantly. He was able to kind of slide right into that aesthetic. There's a scene that I wrote when X-Force shows up, and they're busting into the X-Mansion, and Bishop's got a gun that he's blowing the door open with, and it's just this giant, 3 foot tall, 6 foot long gun. And none of that I had to put in the script. I just said, Bishop's got a big gun and he's blowing the door open, and Scott would deliver it perfectly. The laser tag guns in that first issue are the same way, where they're just so huge.
Right. Now, is it something where you're trying to recreate the 90s color palette?
Our colorist on the book was Matt Milla, and again, we never had to tell anybody. Like, everybody kind of went in knowing what they wanted to do. But we love his coloring on this because everything's so bright, bright and weird in a really cool way. He's actually going to be coming back to do the coloring on the ongoing series that's coming out next year as well. Scott Koblish is, like I said, busy with other projects, but he's going to be doing the coloring on that, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that. And I think it'll help the continuity of, not in terms of comics continuity, but in terms of, just making it feel like the same project.
Right.
Because that color palette is so different from everything else you see in comics. Everything's, neon constantly, which is really fun.
It's interesting because that was the time when comics was transitioning from more of the pulp paper to, I guess, a smoother or shinier.
You had those image glossy papers.
Yeah, and they started going kind of crazy with the color choices, and you can definitely tell a 90s book from an 80s book from a book from the new century just by looking at the color palette that they've chosen to use. One of the things that you wrote about when you were doing the episode guide was the fact that Gambit has a certain pattern and way of speaking, and Rogue has a certain way of speaking. And I noticed that you kind of worked that into the very first issue of X-Men 92. And would you touch a little bit on Sugar?
Oh, the most fun characters to write. When I was, I watched the X-Men animated series, and I really got into the X-Men when I was like 10. I was 10 in 1992, so obviously I was right at the target market. And I loved Gambit and Rogue as a kid. Like, I loved their characters, I loved them together, I loved everything about them. And then, like, when I turned 15, I was like, I don't like these characters anymore. And I kind of, as an adult, I didn't really like them. And then writing them, I got it. Like, I immediately remembered why I love them so much. They're so fun to write, and those accents are a big part of it. That's one of the great things about working with Chad, too, is that we can call each other and literally have conversations as the characters in those accents. So yeah, Gambit's, Thieves Guild, this and that, Cajun accent is really fun. But as people from the South, as being from Columbia, South Carolina, Rogue's accent is so fun because it's just way over the top, further over the top than anything you would actually hear in real life. I think there's, we didn't get to say that she was as nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs, which I think is their classic. But we did our best. We did our best to get those y'alls and sugars in there.
One of the things Claremont always did in every issue was have Rogue say something to the effect of, "I can't touch you."
I can't touch you, Remy. Yeah, that was that one right at the top of the list. It was like Cable, Psylocke, I can't touch you, Remy, like right at the top.
And it works out so well because I'm forgetting the exact moment. I think it was a Rogue Gambit scene that I just was laughing in my office, and people were looking at me like I'm stranger than normally they look at me like I'm strange. And it's a fine balance between having a book that is good action adventure and yet has those intentional moments in it that make the audience say, okay, I get where they're coming from. And so how do you find that balance between telling a story that the average person can read and then somebody who's a little bit more familiar with the era that you're referencing, or they're going to be able to enjoy it on that other level?
It's tough. In a way, it's easy because we love these versions of the characters for so long. These are, it's something from when we were kids, and you always have that affection and that familiarity with it. But trying to blend that comedy and the tribute aspect, and also telling a really compelling action story, which I hope we did, that's really tough. And it's something that we worry about. It's something that, we're always on the phone, Chad and I, trying to be like, okay, is it too much of a joke if they say this? And then usually it's not. Usually we'll go a long way for a laugh, but you have to balance that out with stakes. And one of the things that was fun about the book was that it was so far removed from everything. Because it was a Secret Wars tie-in, but it was a Secret Wars tie-in that wasn't necessarily tied into the ongoing event. There's maybe like 3 or 4 references to the larger Secret Wars crossover in X-Men 92, but that meant that we could do anything. Like, these characters don't have to survive. like we could kill Wolverine if we wanted to. We didn't, of course. But I think the way that we hit on of making the stakes the universe itself, the 90s X-Men, the 90s-ness of the X-Men. Like, the characters might survive, but maybe they won't wear the pouches anymore. Maybe we're going to take that away. What makes, we're going to take away your memories of what makes them special from when you were a kid, which is a big threat, I think. That's a bigger threat than you usually get in comics. So, but that's also very funny, kind of inherently. Cassandra Nova, what she wants in that book is to make the X-Men more appropriate for children, which we thought was hilarious. I don't know, again, no one has laughed at this stuff as much as we have making it, but Cassandra Nova trying to get, Wolverine to stop being violent, to, Gambit and Rogue to stop having sexual tension. All of that stuff that she's trying to do, like telling Jean Grey that she has to be a better character because she's not doing a good job of inspiring the children. That is someone, taking this thing that you loved and that we loved when we were kids, the reason you're picking up this book, because in all honesty, people were not picking up this book because of me and Chad, and maybe more so for Scott because he did such a great job of drawing it. But this is our first Marvel book. Nobody's picking it up because of us. They're picking it up because they like Wolverine in that costume. So the threat of trying to take away that costume, trying to take away hey, maybe Wolverine and Cyclops won't be mad at each other anymore, is one of those things that I felt like it was equal parts compelling and equal parts dangerous for the characters. But it was a tough balance, trying to figure out how to juggle all the parts. It'll give you a new respect for Fabian Nicieza when you have that many characters and that many guest stars trying to all get in at the same time and contribute to the plot. Because that last fight scene, it's Cassandra Nova and a giant 10-headed, 20-armed Sentinel against all the X-Men, all of X-Force. The Morlocks are there. The Generation X kids are there. All the rejected mutants are there. Senator Kelly is there. It's a big conflict with a lot of stuff to juggle. And hopefully, I feel like we managed to hit that balance of it being something that would have that kind of thrill of teasing you with changing the characters that have obviously already been changed. They're not that team anymore, Mm-hmm. So having that in there as a kind of threat to the characters and a threat to the reader, and also having, a lot of jokes, a lot of laughs, a lot of, stuff that you recognize that's presented in a funny way.
Well, I think one of my favorite moments, and it goes back to that very 90s era that you hit on, is Wolverine shopping for a yellow plaid shirt. And then I think he asked if it came in a different color.
Yeah, the store that only has his civilian outfit. The store that has one rack of brown leather jackets and one rack of yellow plaid shirts, and that's it. Rugged being the name of the store, I think was pretty fun. Yeah, we tried to drop a lot of visual gags in that. And for everyone that we wrote, Scott Kilbush threw in 10 more.
Right.
The scene where they get to the Clear Mountain Institute, we were like, they walk past some mutants, Shatterstar is there, Colossus is there, and he took that and drew literally 15, 20 characters in the background, which we looked at it and we were like, oh, well, we were going to use some of those guys later, but I guess we have to rewrite that now. But yeah, all the visual stuff that he brought in, the visual gags that he did are so perfect and so, he's an amazing artist, and I honestly cannot say enough great things about how he nailed the action, he nailed the comedy. We felt bad because we had him design a 10-headed, 20-armed Sentinel, but it all worked out.
It seems like it did. And you were saying that there will be an ongoing series.
Yes. So thank you if ever anybody out there picked it up. But sales were strong enough that we are getting an ongoing series next year. It's not going to be tied into Secret Wars. It's going to be just as though the 90s X-Men are off in their own little Earth 1992. And it's going to be drawn by Alti Fermancia, who did the Star-Lord and Kitty Pryde miniseries for Secret Wars, who's amazing. She is a great new talent to Marvel. She's done some designs for new characters that are perfect. I gave her I can't tell you what it is because it'll blow the surprise. But I said, okay, I want this character to look like exactly the halfway point between this and this. And she drew it. Like, it is exactly the halfway point between these two pieces of reference I sent her. Matt Miller is going to come back to do coloring. Chad and I are obviously back writing it. And we're going to have covers by David Nakayama, who did the sort of lost story variants on some of the issues. It's going to be really fun because we're going to get to do a lot of the stuff that Chad and I kind of batted around among ourselves, because our editors never told us not to do anything, which is amazing. That is not an experience I don't think anyone else has had in comics. But our editors, the only thing they told us was our initial pitch, before we really knew what Secret Wars was, before we really knew how Battle World worked, our initial pitch was that we wanted to see the X-Men going to all the places that you see the X-Men go to. We wanted them to go to Genosha. We wanted them to go to Madripoor and the Moon and do all that stuff. And Jordan kind of sent us an email and he was like, hey, those places don't really exist on Battle World. Like, there is no Canada on Battle World. There's just Westchester. And so we kind of had to rewrite and figure out how to do it in those constraints. And I think it worked out pretty well. But in that first story, you can see us opening up the door. Like, we have characters from other countries show up. The X-Men go to different locations. That's one of the big things that we wanted to do with the ongoing series, where we're going to take them all over the world and show you that 90s style Marvel universe with the X-Men as the focal point. So I think it's going to be really fun. I'm very excited about working with Alti, and I know Chad is as well. And I think it's going to be a really fun time, and that'll start in February.
Now, we have just under a minute left of our show. I just wondered if you could touch briefly on, you worked on Downset Fight. You chose the artist.
We actually didn't.
You didn't? Oh,
no. Scott Kowalczyk was a suggestion from our publisher, Oni Press. They had done some work with him before, but I mean, I would have chosen him because he was fantastic. We have worked with so many great artists in our career.
Okay, well, I'm being told that we have to wrap up, so that question will have to wait for your next appearance on Comic Culture. You've been watching Comic Culture. Our guest has been Chris Sims. We hope you'll join us again next time for another episode. Thanks for watching.